So, episode 4 of House of the Dragon is one of those episodes that you can find a handful of issues with, but that's with a more critical lens. But for simply just enjoyment purposes, this episode really does check a lot of boxes, and I think the reception has been so positive because the lasting memory will be the way the episode ends. This really does seem to be what really swings the overall reception from a lot of fans. Episode 3 ended with Rhaenyra infiltrating King's Landing and meeting with Alicent, and for fans, a lot of that episode's best moments are forgotten, and they're left with this meeting that goes against their own logic. Episode 4 ending after a significant dragon battle that also implemented a lot of good story elements with a lot of weight and consequence, that was digestible and makes sense narratively. That really helps fans look past any imperfections prior. These were my thoughts when I first watched the episode, and after numerous viewings, this remains my opinion. I do want to talk about Aegon in this episode. This whole season has been a wonderful experience watching this character try and fail to balance the various emotions as he has ascended to the Iron Throne, lost a child, attempted to please the small folk, appears strong and competent in this position, while failing to truly grasp the significance of this position. Combine this with tense relationships with his mother and grandfather, and a green council that plots and schemes without his input, there's a variety of thoughts and feelings we've watched Aegon experience in a very short period of time. But it has weighed on him. This character feels invalidated. There's a doubt that he should have been Viserys' heir, but when he is crowned, he falsely believes that this makes him worthy. As he has slowly discovered in episode 4, nobody needs him to do anything other than exist. Aegon is incompetent, and I don't believe there's a greater example than the equally incompetent Kingsguard he's created for himself. When he enters his chambers to find Alicent, you can't help but recognize how disorganized his Kingsguard is when they go to exit the room and bump into each other. It was kind of comical, but it is also very telling about how he has put that Kingsguard together, and it's not because of their experience. While it's silly or even comical, I appreciate having the scene communicate to the audience what doesn't need to be said, although Aemon in a prior scene points out to Aegon that his Kingsguard is less than suitable. The biggest mistake Aegon makes is flying to Rook's Rest to join the battle efforts, unknowingly compromising Aemon and Criston Cole's plan. But what drives Aegon to this is a desire to feel worthy. It's a matter of pride. This scene with Alicent and Aegon offers the truth that everyone can see, that Aegon has refused to acknowledge. He doesn't know how to rule, and he certainly doesn't understand war strategies. It goes back to his desire to take back Harrenhal. While a prominent castle, there's no strategic purpose behind his motive. Perhaps Larys Strong could better advise Aegon the difficulties of uniting the Riverlands to their cause, but he doesn't. Aegon simply wants to undermine the efforts of Cole and Aemond so that his forces are pursuing his ideas, even if his ideas are only driven by pride or ego. This scene with Alicent truly made me feel for Aegon's character. Aegon is ill-prepared to rule, and Alicent knows this and communicates this to him. It's a harsh truth, but if you're Aegon, what are you to think? Your mother and council do not respect you, nor do they value your input. But you also know that you have nothing to add. It leaves the character in this position he never asked for, and now that he has accepted it, even with a crown, he feels just as unworthy as he had before, and the title king has meant nothing to change that. While nobody prepared him for the throne, and while you can sympathize for him, there is a contrast to this character and that of what we see in Aemond. It is Aemond who has invested himself into learning the sword and histories, determined to claim the greatest asset in Westeros by bonding with Vhagar. This is demonstrated further with the fluidity in which Aemond speaks High Valyrian compared to Aegon. While nobody prepared Aegon to be king, he does only have himself to blame for how ill-equipped he is when given the title. Aemon has no expectations placed upon him to be king, yet he has prepared himself regardless of anybody else helping him. He has sought this out as a priority. He found it important, while Aegon has not. Which I think this has played well into the growing resentment Aemon feels for his brother as he watches his brother receive plenty that he has not earned. Ultimately, the truth is too much to accept and sit idle, And this final conversation with Alicent damages his ego so much so that it drives him to the most irrational choice he can make, and that's flying off to Rook's Rest for a battle that he's not prepared to fight. And we're definitely going to come back to this. Now, continuing on for Daemon, we are back with him in Harrenhal, and these visions have truly ramped up. We start the episode with Daemon dreaming that he's back in King's Landing in the throne room. This scene pulls all of the truth from Daemon as he's confronted by teenage Rhaenyra. What Daemon is coming to terms with is that he does envy Rhaenyra, and regardless of what he says or does on the surface, there's this animosity inside him that he believes he's been passed over, that he believes he is best served to rule, and what confronts him the harshest is that Viserys named Rhaenyra heir. It confirms to him that Viserys loved Rhaenyra more than him, and this is something he's quietly refused to accept. But what Harrenhal has become over the last 2 episodes is a place for Daemon to finally confront himself. I find it very important in developing Daemon's arc to keep him away from other characters that can blur the audience's perception, because seeing Daemon through Daemon's eyes is far more revealing than the perceptions we'd receive from, say, Rhaenyra or even his own children. Also, there's a second vision where he sees himself disguised as Aemon, and I think this works in a few ways, but what I gather from this moment is that in Aemon, Daemon can see himself, but a version of himself without the love and connection to his brother Viserys as well as Rhaenyra. Where Aemon is so very similar to Daemon as a second son and brother to a king, there's a disconnect Aemon feels toward Aegon. There's not the same love. I think the thematic similarities between these two will become much more important later, and I believe that's a big part of this vision, because regardless of any similarities, right now, these two characters do have very different circumstances and character development points. But for a deeper dive, you can check out this other video that I did on this subject. I'll put a link in the description. Now, if I were to look at a couple things that didn't really land too well for me personally, it is looking at the Black Council when Rhaenyra returns. I do like the practical demonstration of Jace and Baela trying to guide the council, yet they're just children in the eyes of these other members, and as far as they know, Rhaenyra could be anywhere doing anything at this time, which kind of serves to better demonstrate how impractical Rhaenyra going to King's Landing was, but also brings a scene that some fans were critical of from episode 3 back into our focus, which I don't really like, but what I suppose I do like is that when Rhaenyra returns, the other characters do view this a lot like the audience may have. This was an unnecessary risk, and to assume that suing for peace is even an option feels so naive, yet a little insight into her thinking in reference to her inheriting 80 years of peace, for it only to come undone at the time of her ascension being contested, it does allow us to buy into her dilemma at least a little bit. But for most of us, I think we view this war as inevitable, and other than a lack of Rhaenyra's official declaration of war, the war has already begun. This is where the outcry from the council to send a dragon to Rook's Rest comes into play, and this is where I really would have liked to see more conflict or debate among the Black Council. Obviously, sending Rhaenyra is too great of a risk, and the idea of sending Jace or Baela would be ill-advised, as neither have sent their dragons to war before. Ultimately, Rhaenys declares it must be her, and the justification, I suppose, is her age and experience, as well as her dragon Meleys's battle experience. And I'm sorry, but there's no official record of this battle experience for either of them in House of the Dragon, and that's also true in the source material as well. We don't know anything about Meleys's battle experience. We don't know anything about any battle experience for Rhaenys. It is not documented. But when you're caught up in the episode, I suppose this can pass through without much criticism from a more casual viewer. And that's the perspective that I'm trying to have when I break down this episode. But one reason that it troubles me that Rhaenys goes off to the battle is that ultimately Rhaenys and Meleys are killed, and with Rhaenys' insistence that she goes into this battle, it takes away an opportunity for additional conflict there at that council, which the driving force for all drama and story is conflict. So removing that conflict, I'm not a fan of that. When Corlys finds out that Rhaenys dies, other than being understandably emotional, that inner conflict among the Black Council between Corlys and Rhaenyra may feel a bit contrived if Corlys blames Rhaenyra for this in the future. But when Rhaenys volunteered, there was zero protest from anyone, including Corlys. However, this is a small thing in the grand scheme of this story, but I am curious to see how this is dealt with in future episodes. And also, 2 notes on Corlys. I did like the reveal that Rhaenys could see that Alan of Hull is clearly an illegitimate son of Corlys, and perhaps that will play into Corlys' reaction to the death of his wife. The second note here is, as a book fan and fan of the lore behind A Song of Ice and Fire, Corlys has always been this larger-than-life character who commands so much respect, and he's such a legend. I loved his entrance into the Black Council when Rhaenys is being questioned about why she is even trying to lead the council when she's truly in no position of authority. She hasn't been named hand or anything like that. And then Corlys steps in and everyone kind of just straightens up. It's a small thing, and maybe it's a fanboy moment for myself and nothing profound, but I just really like that moment. I don't know. Now, as far as what this episode is truly going to be judged by, it is the Battle of Rook's Rest. I really like how Criston Cole has been kind of cryptic about his strategy, and Gwaine Hightower kind of acts like their entire army is at the mercy of Cole's strategy, and it kind of is. And that's because they don't actually know the plan. They leave Duskendale, and it seems like an absolute lunatic strategy moving forward. They're going to just go attack Rook's Rest during the day. But then Rhaenys and Meleys show up, and that's just what Cole had anticipated, and that's exactly what he wanted. I like that at first they find a practical way to camouflage Aemon and Vhagar. Vhagar, who seems to be almost like a flying version of Godzilla, is really interesting visually. However, these stealth moments for a dragon this size does start to ask a bit much of the audience. Regardless, the thing I really enjoyed about this battle is that there is the question about, are these smaller castles even important? But the idea is to seal off the Blacks from the land, almost trapping them on Dragonstone. But Rook's Rest does seem insignificant. But as Meleys shows up and then Aegon and Sunfire, suddenly the stakes become so much more than just taking over this castle. Now, we can debate about Aemon's reasoning for not following through with the plan immediately, and I think that's a big part of what will keep people talking about this episode long after this season ends, is what's going on with Aemon. What was he thinking? What were his true motives? But I think it's pretty clear. Aemon decided to let Aegon live with this reckless decision to insert himself into a battle he had no business participating in. And then from Aegon's perspective, I love how there is no real false hope that he can hold his own with Sunfire vs. Meleys. In part because it is such a mismatch between these two dragons, but also Aegon has no idea how to use Sunfire in battle, and it goes so bad for him immediately, which I actually love. It makes the weight of Aegon's arc for this season really flow perfectly. His incompetence as a ruler due to his inexperience is specifically what the conversation between himself and Alicent really summarizes. And it's one thing sitting at the head of the Green Council or upon the Iron Throne, but when true physical harm is at play, Aegon's thinking almost instantly punishes him. Now, when Aemon does finally appear with Vhagar, and I did think that entrance was really awesome. However, I think there is a really interesting detail here for anyone who believes Aemon accidentally burned Aegon and Sunfire. When Rhaenys and Meleys first aim for Aegon and Sunfire, Rhaenys commands Meleys to attack in Valyrian, of course, but she doesn't say Dracarys. And while Aegon does say Dracarys, Meleys does her best to avoid it, and I thought Rhaenys was burnt, and it certainly looked that way, but apparently I guess it was just a close call. I don't really know, and maybe you could nitpick that and say that she should have been burned there. I don't know. I'm looking past that. However, Meleys attacks by biting and entangling herself with Sunfire, and then digs her claws or talons, whatever you want to call it, into Sunfire, causing significant damage. Now, my point is that there are clearly different commands for calling for the dragons to either breathe fire or to attack. So when Aemon yells Dracarys, we should know that this was not his only option to separate Sunfire and Meleys. Aemon has proven to be well-studied and informed with his High Valyrian earlier in the episode, and I believe this is intentional, but I understand why some of you may not view it that way. I believe that it is obvious that Aemon is pleased with the result of Aegon being hurt or worse, instead, and I think Aegon being harmed was intentional. There's one scene that I really thought was pretty great too visually, and that's when we see Meleys and Vhagar heading straight for one another, truly giving us the scale for the difference in these two dragons. And when you recall earlier in the episode that Meleys is the biggest dragon for the Blacks, and to see that dragon dwarfed by Vhagar, it visually communicates why just having more dragons than the Greens is not necessarily a huge advantage for the Blacks. Now, I know there's criticism for how Vhagar was able to hide behind a building and play this stealth role, and yeah, I think that's actually kind of ridiculous, but when I'm watching two dragons fighting, I just do not share that energy some may have to point out how impractical this strategy might be or if it seems unrealistic. It didn't ruin the scene for me, but I also admit that the dragon fights aren't necessarily what draws me to this story to begin with. Yeah, I understand the criticism, and I agree it is valid. I personally just am not that invested in how these unworldly beasts are utilized. What I am much more interested in is how the story is actually further developed within the battle scene. I know a lot of people think of the Battle of the Bastards, Hardhome, or maybe even the Spoils of War, these battles from Game of Thrones, but I think the battle falls more in line with the Battle of the Blackwater from Season 2 of Game of Thrones. The reason why is that those other battles I mentioned, as far as impact on the story, it is primarily focused on the end result of the battle, who won and who lost, and while it is significant who won or lost the Battle of the Blackwater, there's story developments that occur within that battle that have huge significance, where Rickon dies in the Battle of the Bastards, and it has no weight to it after the episode. Rhaenys dying will have a huge impact. Aemond, whether intentionally or not, attacked Aegon. It's similar to Tyrion being attacked by the Kingsguard man and more, which is a significant moment for Tyrion's character. Even the way the war is won has significant consequences for Tyrion's character development, as he's not given the credit because the Tyrells and Tywin's forces ultimately defeat what was left of Stannis' army. This is also the episode that the Hound abandons Joffrey. A lot more than just a battle is occurring, and that is absolutely true for Rook's Rest here in House of the Dragon. For Criston Cole, he seems truly devastated that the king was severely hurt, and it has me wondering, does he question Aemond's motives, or does he see it as an accident? With Aegon being hurt or even killed, this obviously has far more impact on the story than just who actually wins this battle. There's so much available here for what this means as far as character developments with Aemond, I think Criston Cole as well, and the entire Greens. The propaganda that will be spread throughout King's Landing by the Greens, and as far as the Blacks, losing their largest dragon, but also with the death of Rhaenys, that will be an impact on the entire council. Rhaena and Baela lost their grandmother, and with it taking so many years to actually earn the support and admiration from Rhaenys, this won't be taken lightly by Rhaenyra either. But the biggest impact of Rhaenys' death will be how it impacts Corlys. Corlys is the primary character I'm most interested to observe from here, and that as well, what is going on with Aemond, what were his intentions, and I'm so excited to see that developed as well. These battles are all visually interesting, but the heart and soul of this world George R. Martin has created is the human heart in conflict with itself, and the political drama that spins out of these conflicted characters is where I've always found myself most invested. What I love about the battle is that it offers so much conflict and emotional weight for a variety of characters, and I cannot wait to see the fallout from this episode. Let me know what you liked or what you disliked about this episode, especially on those areas that I didn't really touch on here in this review. I really wanted to focus on just a handful of things that really jumped out at me. And for more House of the Dragon Season 2 content, you can check out this playlist right here.